You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm Ankit Panda, editor-at-large at The Diplomat and a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment, coming to you live from New York. And I'm delighted today to be joined by The Diplomat's newest editor. Joining me is Sebastian Strangio. How are you, Sebastian?
I'm very well, thanks, Ankit. Thanks for having me.
Well, welcome to the podcast and welcome to The Diplomat. So some of our listeners may be aware of your work, Sebastian, because I've actually been reading you for quite a while. You've had quite the career before The Diplomat, and I was hoping, since this is your inaugural appearance on the podcast, you could tell us a little bit about your time in Southeast Asia and earlier before you found your way to The Diplomat. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I got my beginning in Southeast Asia as a journalist in Cambodia. I went there in 2008, and I spent 8 years there reporting, firstly, for the first few years on Cambodian domestic politics at one of the local newspapers. And then I began traveling around the region more widely. So I started freelancing for numerous publications, including The Diplomat, and traveled mostly focusing on mainland Southeast Asia, but I did begin to expand into the maritime region as time went by as well. And then I've just recently moved home to Australia after more than a decade abroad. And so I'm now sort of observing Southeast Asian affairs from here. And I'm hoping that once travel reopens, that I'll be able to get back regularly to keep tabs on what's happening. It is a challenge to, see what's going on from a distance.
Absolutely, yeah. It's very, I find that myself too. It's just you really need to be able to meet people, especially in person. Virtual events just don't cut it at some point. Having those conversations in person is really crucial. But I do also want to draw attention to our listeners to your new book, a very timely book on a very timely subject that we've discussed quite a bit on this podcast before. The book is called In the Dragon's Shadow, Southeast Asia and the Chinese Century. I haven't yet read the book, I must apologize. But Sebastian, can you summarize the core arguments and themes for our listeners?
Well, the book examines, probably one of the most significant foreign policy questions of our time. What does China's resurgence and return to great power status mean for the world? And of course, Southeast Asia occupies a very, unique and particularly fraught position in this story, given its proximity to China, its centuries of interaction with it. And it's historically the strong American security presence that has been in the region since the end of the Second World War. A lot of strategists in Western countries are speaking now about the Indo-Pacific as a sort of unified strategic arena. And of course, there's no region that is more quintessentially Indo-Pacific than Southeast Asia. I mean, it touches both of these oceans and sprawls between them. And so my book, I got interested in looking at this subject when I was in Cambodia, when I witnessed firsthand this surging growth in Chinese investment, Chinese expatriates, Belt and Road Initiative projects that were opening up isolated corners of the country and bridging Cambodia's rivers. And I began to look at this issue on my travels throughout the region. And so this book is sort of the culmination of my explorations into that question. So I look at the impacts that, China's investment is having on the ground. I also look at the way that the nations of the region are responding to it and responding to the challenge posed by a resurgent China. And I look at how the domestic politics in each of these countries and centuries of interaction with China have conditioned their responses or limited the options available to them in terms of responding. And then I sort of try and cast forward and ask what this all means for, the future of the Indo-Pacific, or, in the context of this escalating tension between China and the United States.
So just to rewind a second, you referenced the newly popular notion of the Indo-Pacific, and there was some concern, I guess, around 2018 when Jim Mattis went to the Shangri-La dialogue and professed that ASEAN centrality would not be impinged on by this concept of the Indo-Pacific. How do, especially, I guess, foreign policy elites in Southeast Asia, in your view, feel about this conceptualization of this vast region? I mean, frankly, just we're talking about depending on the definition of Indo-Pacific, all the way from San Diego to Tanzania in many ways. How do Southeast Asian elites feel about this conceptual framing of Asia?
Well, I think it's important to recognize that there were some elites in Southeast Asia and strategic thinkers who were bandying about this term,
Mm-hmm.
as far back as the middle of the last decade. Um, is always just sort of an idea. And I think that it sort of took the United States, and to a certain extent Japan, to sort of really, make this idea into to popularize it and mainstream it in the way that it has been over the past few years. I think in general, the 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 governments of the region welcome this strategy as a signal of American commitment to the region, or they welcome America's increased attention towards Southeast Asia. But I think there's some concern that the Indo-Pacific is, motivated overwhelmingly by, the desire to contain China, and the framing of the Indo-Pacific as this free and open, you know, uh, characterized by free and open principles in counterpoise to the closed nature of China's authoritarian system, which I think is, a bit of a concern, I suppose, for some nations in the region.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, I think there is a sense that this strategy lacks specifics when it comes to Southeast Asia. Like, there's been a lot of talk about focus on China, but there hasn't been a lot to the strategy that sort of responds to Southeast Asian development needs, or takes into account, I think, the more complex and anguished position that the region occupies vis-a-vis China. I mean, of course, it's very early days, and this, if we do see a changeover of administrations in the United States, we may see a Biden administration taking a different
Mm-hmm.
perspective or using the Indo-Pacific idea in a different way. But I think it's, there's the region at the moment is still sort of in a wait and see phase as regards this new American strategy.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm not a Southeast Asia specialist by any means, but in my years, sort of following the region, traveling there, it just seems that so much of the orientation of specific countries is just deeply influenced by domestic political developments. I think a few of the starker examples in recent years, certainly the Aquino Duterte transition in the Philippines, but also more recently the Najib to Mahathir change of government as well. I mean, you just saw
Mm.
significant change in, I guess, opposite directions in both cases. But I'm just wondering, I mean, in the course of your book, I mean, do you come down on attributing a weight to, let's say, domestic developments in these countries? I guess Cambodia is another good example, versus what China and the United States are extrinsically doing in Southeast Asia actively, sort of Chinese efforts to lobby for investment in these countries. Which do you find has a greater explanatory weight for the general orientation of these countries towards the U.S. and China?
Well, I think that domestic politics is, in many places is determinative. It shapes and limits
Mm-hmm.
the choices open to these countries and how they respond both to China's inducements, but also the increasing competition and rivalry between these two superpowers. I think that each nation faces a similar challenge vis-a-vis China. How you can benefit economically from trade and investment without compromising your sovereignty or being absorbed into a Chinese orbit. And I think each country's met this challenge in ways reflecting the limits and also um, the assets available to them. And so I would say that that I would probably argue that domestic determinants are more important in some ways than either the China or the United States does.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of what projects are agreed to, in terms of the Belt and Road, and how these nations respond to the United States as well. I think there's been, we constantly see again and again. I think the examples you cited are are quite opposite. The Philippines under Duterte and Malaysia under Najib, both, their engagements with China have both been driven overwhelmingly by what they need domestically, and the sort of inability to stand up to China in a very robust way has also reflected, the priorities that they've chosen in their domestic politics and the need for Chinese support to advance those projects. One might also cite Jokowi in Indonesia, where he's pledged to this massive multi-billion-dollar scheme of infrastructure building designed to sort of bind the Indonesian islands together and improve the lives of its 250 million people. He sees China as a practical, results-oriented power that's able to, fast track those sorts of projects. So, of course, this has impacted his stance on China on a whole range of issues. Leaving aside the fact that he's a leader who doesn't have a lot of interest in foreign affairs to begin with.
Right. I mean, just to oversimplify everything a little bit, since we're on a podcast here, if we had to rank the countries of Southeast Asia based on, I guess, their proximity to China, on one hand, being 10 and proximity to the U.S. being 0, where would you put, I guess, the countries of the region? Which ones are closest to China and which ones are furthest?
I think, so I would say that the countries that are probably the closest to China, or the most, leaving aside the ranking for just a second, the countries that are historically have been the most accommodative of Chinese power, I think, are the ones that dwell in the mainland parts of Southeast Asia, but do not share borders with China. So Thailand and Cambodia have been, Cambodia at the moment is probably the 10 or the 9 in your scale. But Thailand has also been, historically, quite accommodative to Chinese power and very much in favor of economic connections with China. And the fact that it doesn't share a border has dampened that, the concern that China's growing power has elicited from other powers. Whereas you see with Vietnam, it's probably a country that's most proximate to China in cultural and historical terms. But that proximity has been so intense that it's produced this really fraught dialectic of resistance alongside emulation. And so you see probably, the most complicated relationship with China in the region is also the country that's closest to it in terms of history and culture. To go back to the ranking, I think that you would probably place Cambodia at 9, Laos at around 8.5, the Thais probably around 6.5-ish, Myanmar probably around the same. I think there's more fears in Myanmar, but the human rights situation has complicated relations with Western countries to such an extent that it is hard for Myanmar to maintain good relationships. And so it's sort of had to lean on China, or it feels that it has to lean on China for diplomatic support. I think Vietnam I'd place bang in the middle at 5. I think that the Vietnamese, are very cautious about deepening their relationship with the United States beyond a certain point, given that there has historically been, that China looms on the northern border, and that any time Vietnam has been perceived to be acting as a proxy for a larger power, it is elicited, pretty swift rebukes from the Chinese. So from there, I think, if we're just looking at the current administrations, I think you would probably have to place Duterte again at around 6.5. Jokowi would probably be around 6. Of course, the Philippine security establishment would be more of a 1 or 2, I think, given the weight of historical connections to the United States. And Malaysia, I think, would probably be, around a 5.5 or 6. Singapore, again, I think bang in the middle at 5. I think they've been incredibly astute at balancing between the two superpowers, and very outspoken on the need for those powers to sort of dampen their escalating rivalry. And who have I left out? Brunei. We we never talk that much about Brunei, but I'd say that's probably at around 6.5 as well. Did I leave anyone out?
No, you mentioned Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, Thailand. Yeah, I think we're all set. You actually when you were describing Singapore's balancing efforts, you kind of preempted my next question, which is this messaging. So first of all, you have messaging from the United States in recent months that has been telling countries in Southeast Asia and elsewhere that Washington is not asking them to choose between the U.S. and China. And then you get the counter complaint from Southeast Asian leaders and strategic elites in many cases that the region is being chosen to make or asked to make a choice, and that rather they would have the United States and China control their differences. And you just covered this for the diplomats. So I wanted to ask you about this more specifically. But Jokowi, Duterte both just used their speeches at the United Nations General Assembly this year, of course, all virtually, to again reinforce this message. What is to be made of this? Why are Southeast Asian leaders trying to push back on this notion of great power competition so ardently?
Well, I think that, again, it comes down to Southeast Asia's position between the two of the powers. This is a region that's economically enmeshed with China. I mean, China is the leading trade partner, I think, of 8 of the 10 ASEAN nations. I haven't looked at the most recent statistics. And is a prominent investor, an increasingly prominent investor in all of them. It's also a nation that dwells very, close to hand. And so it's a nation that has to be handled very carefully. And I think there is a concern that this escalating US-China rivalry will, even if it stops short of an open conflict, will put strains on all of the Southeast Asian nations, that it could, interrupt their economic relationships with China, and that it could, put them in the position of having to make difficult choices. Not necessarily one grand choice, but a lot of small and complex choices. And both China and the United States are in a position, if they wanted to really hurt countries that don't do what they want. And I think, one of the challenges that these countries face is, on the one hand, the U.S. has said, we don't want you to choose. But the way that a lot of American policymakers have framed rivalry with China, at least rhetorically, is as a sort of ideological choice that there is, this is a battle between democracy and freedom, and on the one hand, and authoritarianism on the other. The free and open Indo-Pacific, it leans very heavily on this rhetoric about democratic principles. Even though once you get down to the domestic level, things look a lot less clear. Obviously, in the case of India, for instance, of the Quad countries, to say that India is like-minded on questions of liberal values, is probably a bit of a stretch, at least under Narendra Modi. And so, I think that these nations are, the last Cold War was one in which they really did have to choose. It was not very easy to maintain neutrality in that conflict. And for many of the nations of the region, it had existential stakes. And I think that they're, very cautious about being put into a position where they have to, choose a side in an ideological struggle. I don't think any of the nations see US-China competition overwhelmingly as an ideological struggle. I think they see it as a rivalry between two large powers that are each self-absorbed and each concerned about their own global standing, and each of whom often overlooks or looks through the Southeast Asian region and treats it as a front in this wider struggle. And I think that the Southeast Asian perspective tends to treat the United States and China more or less as equivalent units, as strategic units. And I think that often puts the noses of American officials out of joint, because there's an implied moral equivalence. But I think what they're really drawing is sort of a strategic parallel between these two large powers that each struggling for primacy in at least in the Indo-Pacific region, and potentially further afield.
Yeah, no, the metaphor you hear quite often in, I guess, Singapore, in my experience, is, when the elephants fight, the ants underground get trodden over. And
yes,
that I think very much captures that equivalency that you were describing.
Yeah.
But implicit in in your description there of both powers as self-absorbed. I mean, it is interesting that there is this both skepticism and room for accommodation for both the United States and China in Southeast Asia. Is that changing at a different rate today, either based on the actions of the Trump administration or, of course, China under Xi Jinping in recent years? Which way is the wind blowing in your view?
Well, it's hard to say. We've got the American election coming up in about 6 weeks, and so much of the Trump administration's rhetoric toward China and almost daily escalations in terms of restricting Chinese companies and various sanctions, seem to be motivated, at least in part, by, domestic political considerations. And so we'll have to wait and see, if Joe Biden is elected, what position the United States takes on China. Now, I think the pre-Trump era of engagement is over. I don't think we're going to be going back to sort of the Obama era in terms of how the U.S. approaches China. I think a corner has been turned in views of China. But I do think we could see something a little bit more cohesive and level-headed. At least the potential is there for a form of competition that sort of eschews these very stark ideological binaries, and that that engages Southeast Asian nations a little bit, and other nations as well, more effectively. But this remains to be seen. I think that the Chinese government has sort of taken off its cloak of self-effacement, and it's behaving like a great power. In some ways, it's behaving in a very similar way to the way the United States behaved in the Western Hemisphere in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Mm-hmm. It's trying to secure its interests and establish its hegemony over its sensitive parts of its neighborhood. It's doing so in a way that reflects the nature of the Chinese communist system, and the rhetoric and the way that this is presented, may reflect also the different sort of historical orientation of the Chinese state. Although I think that that can sometimes be overstated. But I think that its behavior. I don't think that we're going to see a serious forswearing of Chinese ambition. I think that this new powerful, both self-confident and brittle Chinese power is, I think, here to stay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's right. Sebastian, I am unfortunately we're out of time, but I do want to welcome you to the podcast, and of course, welcome you to The Diplomat. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was fun.
Great. Yeah, I really hope to have you back on to discuss developments in Southeast Asia. For listeners, if you've been a subscriber to the podcast but you haven't yet left us a review, we'd really appreciate if you could do that. It really helps get the word out about the show. And if you haven't yet subscribed, please do so. We'd love for you to keep up with future coverage on this podcast. Finally, before we close, a quick note from our sponsor. This episode of the Asia Geopolitics Podcast is brought to you by Diplomat Risk Intelligence, or DRI. DRI is the consulting and analysis division of The Diplomat, the Asia-Pacific's leading current affairs magazine. Since its launch in 2002, The Diplomat has been dedicated to quality analysis and commentary on events and trends in Asia and around the world, and is now one of the most respected publications covering the region. DRI inherits this approach and offers clients in the private, public, and nonprofit sectors worldwide access to an exclusive network of subject matter experts and analysts. Whatever your needs in the wider Asia-Pacific region, DRI can offer the knowledge and expertise necessary to anticipate and manage geopolitical and geoeconomic risks. For more information, please visit dri.thediplomat.com. Thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back soon with more.